I have questions for both of you, but I'll start with Alejandro. So this is on some level, a war movie, a combat movie, a film about armed conflict, and it's set in Colombia. The Colombian conflict, as we know, is a notoriously complicated and long-running one. With sort of very complicated particulars. Yet you've made a film that removes a lot of details. Can you talk about the decision to move the film in that direction, more abstract, more hallucinatory?
No, the film came from a lot of places, and certainly one of them is Colombia's civil war armed struggle has been going on for so many decades, close to 60 years. It's written about in literature, and you see it in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novels, and it's on and ongoing, and in some ways people lose sensibility to it. And for me it was important to approach it, but approach it in a way that spoke to my generation. And I say that, I think mainly because of three things. One is, there's now a fragile possibility of peace. There's a peace accord, and it's not the first peace agreement. The past ones have failed, and the ghosts of those past failed agreements really is what drove the desire to shape it in a sort of fever dream, that hallucinatory feel, because the film plays with time. I mean, it was very purposely designed so you don't know exactly the date. And that's because I think it's the ghost of the past and then what's going to happen in the future. And then it's unresolved in the sense that right now, there's big fears. Yes, peace was signed. The former president was given the Nobel Peace Prize for creating this peace accord, and peace was signed with the bosses. But what about the groups that have splintered off and continue to wage war even with a different name? And you see Bigfoot start his own organization in the film. You see that, and then the big question is, what happened to those people that lay down their arms, be it from the left or the right? And that's what you hear at the end with where to go now over the helicopter radio. And I think the last thing that was really important for me is, my grandfather fought in World War II, and I grew up listening to those stories, and the lines of war there seem to be much more clearly drawn, right? Whereas here, I think for our generation, you ask people in the United States, where exactly do we stand in Syria? The alliances keep shifting, the lines are very blurry, there's a certain fog of war. Conflict today seems very irregular, unconventional. I think people like World War II stories because it's more clear where you stand. In a country with so many fronts like Colombia, where you have paramilitaries, guerrillas, narcos, foreign actors, the state, it was important for you to approach all the characters through their humanity. So you didn't know whether the sympathies were with the left or the right. And the same thing with a kidnapped person. You don't know if maybe she's a US tourist, maybe she's an engineer from a mining company, or maybe she's a CIA operative. And the question is she more deservedly kidnapped because she's one or the other? I don't think so. So releasing that context, I felt, would help you reach that kind of allegorical power that Conrad's Heart of Darkness has, and William Golding's Lord of the Flies, things I read and were tattooed in my head when I was in 8th grade, and I wanted to speak to that war genre, but do it from the inside out. You see a lot of foreign powers come to these developing countries, these foreign jungles, and act, but I felt like I hadn't seen a war film that spoke with Apocalypse Now, spoke to Come and See, but from the inside out, not from the outside in.
So I wanted to hear you both talk a little bit about the shooting process. It does not seem like it was the easiest film to make, physically and logistically. But maybe you want to start by just talking about how you put this really amazing group of actors together, because it is kind of group casting, really. I mean, they sort of have to work together.
Right. Yeah, that was the key to the film. Those are the real foundations, which you're asking. We looked at over 800 kids for a year in Colombia. We looked also abroad, and we found Moises, who's been working abroad since he's 10. And out of those 800, looking schools, acting workshops, just on the street, visiting locations, just finding these people. We chose 30 and took them to this sort of mock basic training camp. And in the morning, I would do improv and acting exercises with them. And then in the afternoon, they would do very severe physical training and military training, but not regular military, but since they had to be clandestine soldiers. And I found a deserted, someone who had deserted an illegal army in Colombia. He had been fighting in it since he was 11 years old, and he deserted when he was 24, and he was in hiding for many years, and I found him in a government reinsertion program, and I hired him a consultant to train the kids. And he was so convincing, so good, that it's actually the guy that plays the messenger in the film. He's a former guerrilla fighter, and he's part of this peace process. Anyway, out of seeing how those 30, apart from their individual performances during this sort of mock boot camp, how they behaved, I saw who liked who flirted with who sat next to who in the cafeteria. So I could see that kind of mini society kind of interact, thinking, okay, not only how do I get individually the best person, but as a group, because I think that was the important thing, and those were the 8 monos. And Moises, who I was sure I wanted to work with, I still made him go through that whole process, so he was eating, sleeping, showering in like a sort of bunker military scenario with a bunch of people, some of which, or the majority of which, had never seen a film camera in their lives.
I'd love to hear your take, Moises.
Yeah, everything that Alejandro said brings back memories. It was a very difficult experience from day one. Reading the script, I knew that it was going to be a tough experience, but not as difficult as it turned out to be. I didn't purposefully speak English for a couple months. That means my family, my brother especially. And yeah, in El Páramo, in let's call it the mountain, scenes that you saw were extremely cold, extremely difficult situations of, defending ourselves in these scenes. So we were in bunkers that were flooded with water, and we were there until 2 or 3, however late, it didn't really matter. We lost a sense of time, but the man that trained us really just didn't see a difference between training actual soldiers and us. Yeah. From 4 a.m. dumping our luggage bags to the floor, and then to the acting classes, which really allowed us to bond and really understand the scenes and what points we had to get to. Especially all the other kids not having acted in a film before. And for me, the language was the most difficult part. Spanish is my first language, but I had never worked outside of the United States, maybe Mexico, but still in English with an accent. In Colombia, it was life-changing. These kids are my family. I saw them in Cartagena a couple of weeks back, and it brought back beautiful memories. It's just, we worked really hard on something that came out beautiful, thanks to Alejandro.
Were there particular scenes that were especially difficult to, either for you, Moises, or for you to direct?
Just physically, the water rapid was unlike anything I've done before.
I mean, I was carried out on a stretcher a couple of times, so I mean, we were all on the limits of what we could do physically. I mean, the mountain is shot at 4,000 meters. I mean, nearly 14,000 feet in the air. So the lack of oxygen, the place, we were trying to create this otherworldly feel and so that was very intense. And then in the mountain, in the jungle, to get there, we needed to go down, drive for hours, and then go down in mules, and then take rafts, and then after that kayaks, and arrive at this base. And we were down there, and basically our production assistants were a team of professional kayakers a troop of mules and this big, kind family of illegal gold miners that lived down in the river. So it was them, us, and a sad film that worked ever so often. And that's how we basically put it together. But I think just on a directing side, what was key for me was to play with a very, I like the grays in morality because I think that's what makes us so complex, and I like to explore that. So I think we were consistently trying to find characters like Doctorio, who you see all of a sudden change in the film. Same thing as Bigfoot, Lady. I mean, characters that it's tough moral questions. I mean, do you leave Smurf tied to the tree or not? And that was a particularly tough one because Smurf comes from a neighborhood in Medellin that you need to ask permission to a kind of boss to even come into. So the idea of him crying in front of 60 people that are in a set was very tough to get to, but we kind of worked it, and his performance is so strong when the boots are taken off his foot and he's left there, and he asks Doctora to take me with you, and he saw the film at Sundance for the first time just, I think it's 2 months ago, and he saw it and he approached me at the end and he said, "Did I really do that, or were those digital effects?" He really thought they were digital effects. I'm like, yeah, that's just you.
The locations are really important in the film. I'm wondering if did you seek them out before you started writing, or did finding them change the film for you in any way, just in terms of how it was structured?
I was looking for places like that so you could really break places that were very specific, that were characters in and of themselves, but you wouldn't recognize it. I mean, a lot of Colombians ask me, "Where did you shoot?" Right? And when I found that place, which is a sort of highland, wetland, but it's so far up, it's actually the reservoir of water in Colombia, and water goes down the mountain, trickles down, gaining more and more speed until it reaches those rapids you see in the end. So actually the structure of the film was very much inspired on the locations, going from the clouds, which condense, turn into water, and then we wanted to structure it in the edit very much like a river, so you were consistently in movement, looking at the multiplicity of the different points of views of the characters who were meandering, winding, changing speeds, and at the end, finding yourself in a torrent of speed that kind of shoots you out. So water and the river was kind of the way we shaped it, so landscapes were very inspired for that. And generally what I do is, I have the screenplay, and as soon as I find the locations and the people, I rewrite the screenplay to make sure that I'm not forcing the page on life, but actually bringing life onto the page. So I make sure I do that. So the locations were really key in shaping the structure of the film, shaping the film like a river.
Yeah. This idea of bringing life, drawing from life into this seems to connect with your previous work. I mean, your first film was a documentary, and Porfirio is a fiction film in which the actor plays himself. So I'm just wondering if there are other ways in which your sort of documentary side sort of played into this film, which seems, very much like an allegory, like a parable. But I'm wondering if your documentarian side sort of fed certain aspects of it.
Yeah, I think the ability to, what I find exciting about making a film is not directing or executing, but truly making, exploring, finding the film, finding it again. And I think, when you make a documentary, you're forced to really not try to project your wishes on the world, but actually just observe and look, and then try to see what magic is there. It was a really good school, and what I find to create a lot of tension is the juxtaposition between naturalism and stylization. And I think that creates a certain hyper reality. And I mean that by saying it's mostly natural lighting, a lot of real places, real faces, people that haven't acted before. So they have a high degree of naturalism, but the way it's set up in the mise en scène is very stylized. So I think many times you see a film and you're like, okay, it's this type of film, so you feel relaxed because you can put that film in a box. But when a film kind of defies that box, sometimes it feels very real, sometimes it feels very trippy. It creates, it's rather unsettling, and I find that to be tense. That's something I look for in my work. And even, even though everything, the screenplay, the technical screenplay was written out, I try to kind of systematically invoke the unexpected. So for example, the character Boom Boom didn't even exist until about 10 days before we started shooting. And I just brought him into the screenplay to create something new.
Great. All right, we're going to take some questions from the audience. I'm sure there are quite a few. We have microphones, so if you want to raise your hand, we'll bring you the mic. Middle.
I don't know if I should stand up. Well, speaking to the prep, Moises, that you were talking about, the training, was there any point where you feel like maybe it's not a good idea, or did you feel like this is the journey that I want to embark on and put your trust in Alejandro?
His agent never thought it was a good idea.
Correct.
Yeah, no, I think from the script, I was blown away and knew if I had the opportunity to be a part of this, what I was getting myself into. But Alejandro's right. No one did help it to happen. But no, in terms of actually getting to shooting days, whatever Alejandro said was whatever he said I did. And I hurt myself a couple times, but nothing too crazy. I think when you see a man with how he speaks, his ideas and his sort of direction, it's special and it's rare. And just by how you were speaking the locations, I knew that we were a part of something special. And Pata Grande, if it's, I don't want to use half-assed, but if it's not all the way there, then it's not Pata Grande.
Hi, can you talk a little bit more about the music? Is the music composed by Mika Levy? It's really impressive.
Yeah, this is British composer Mika Levy. She did Under the Skin or Jackie, if you're familiar with that. And she came on board with an unfinished cut of the film, really connected with the kind of the faces, the places, the colors, the spirit of the film. And so we wanted something that was epic, but also atemporal. And we started working together. I went to London and then a couple times, and we found that whistle, then the timpani, and we started working with that. Initially, there was a sort of a spaghetti western influence, and in the end, it was, I think, there was this mishmash of things. For example, you have more classic winds and strings, and then you have things that come from possibly like a Berlin nightclub, like that shot of adrenaline that's just a pure almost nightclub score, and that helped you break the notion of time and also gave it a certain I think it spoke to the adolescent, the youth of the movie, and something we spoke about a lot was, and I asked her for, was for us to look into giving the characters a musical note, because one of the biggest challenges of the film is the amount of characters that it has, and they're all kind of protagonists in a way, even though the true protagonist is the group. So we went into a sort of Peter and the Wolf approach. So for example, certain characters had musical notes, and to give you an example, whenever the messenger or the organization appears, you have a very shrill high whistle, and that is supposed to signal that emotional cue of this shadow force kind of lording over the group. And so and we were working like that with her, and then in the end, we all met up in Buenos Aires where the sound mix was done, and I had my sound designer there, and Mika, and we worked for weeks, and it was one of the highlights of the film, just really weaving together the sound design, which is more environmental, and then the music, which is much more narrative, and making that happen together. And I can't imagine making a film any other way, where you have the sound designer and the composer working together to kind of find something that that is strong and has a very strong, not style, but identity. There's only about 20 minutes of music in the entire film. But it's very strong and purposeful when it's used, very incisive. I don't like music when it's used as a sort of bed or crutch.
Hello, Moises, congratulations. I wanted to ask, you mentioned Cartagena, and I wanted to ask, what were you expecting the reaction to the film to be in Colombia, and how was it received?
It was very special. I mean, I guess I definitely thought about the idea of it being played in the country that it was filmed in. And honestly, if you understand Spanish, this is a very different dialect, a very different head, and once understood, it brings it to a whole different level. And that being said, I didn't grow up in Colombia. I don't have the high school experience or the homies like I do in English. I had to really, Alejandro likes to say that I helped the kids a lot with the acting, but in turn they helped me more than they could imagine.
A lot of them had never seen the film.
Oh yeah, in Cartagena was the first time that everybody saw the film and that everybody was back together after 3 years, so that was unbelievable. And that city's alive and beautiful, especially during that festival.
It was, it was really exciting because we won at Sundance, and then Berlin was really remarkable, but we were all kind of nervous because it's different when you come back home because your toughest critics are always at home. And so we screened there with about 600 people, and I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen, and then the lights came on, and you heard from the rafters, people started to go, and it just was really exciting, and Julianne Nicholson and Mika Levy were there, and all the kids were there, and Julianne started crying because she was very taken, and this is very sensitive subject matter, even though it's treated in a very allegorical way, and it does span and break free from Colombia, but people there do live it in a different way. And then we won the only prize there is there, which is the Audience Award, and so we have a distributor there that's going to distribute the film in August. And I'm very happy that they're going to do it very wide and big, and I think it's a moment in the country where hopefully the film will be part of a conversation that's happening. It's not a film that has answers, but it's a film that I think is part of the conversation that needs to be had.
Are there specific political resonances for a Colombian audience that has lived through the conflict that an American audience might miss?
I think it's those fears that still linger from that peace accord. How are we going to receive the people that have laid down their arms? How are they going to receive the people in the cities? What are we going to do with these new organizations that have been formed? And but fortunately, because the film, you see that the kids are passionate what they do. Some of them, it's clear that they might have entered because of choice, and they're fighting and they're there, and you see almost this degree of innocence and desire at the beginning. But you don't know what political spectrum they come from. And I think that fortunately the film was able to break that, and people lived it as a thrilling ride. But certainly it's a much more delicate subject matter.
In the front?
So you
Is the microphone? It's,
so you said the film doesn't have answers, in a way, and I'm curious what were the main questions that you had since the film, what were the two main questions?
Yeah, I think whenever you approach the human species in a group and the dynamics of power, you're talking about something that breaks. I mentioned Conrad's Out of Darkness or Lord of the Flies. What happens in the context of the ivory trade, or what happens in the context of British society in World War I. But those tales talk to you because you ask yourself, who are we as a species? And I think that those power dynamics and those tones of gray and those questions you ask yourself to gain your liberty. Would you kill that little girl? Would you leave Smurf tied to the tree? what would you do in the case of Wolf when he kills himself? Do you tell the truth and cause a dog to suffer a firing squad, or do you hide it like Bigfoot suggested and seemed logical at the time? I think there's those questions that you ask yourself, but clearly there's deeper political complexities in Colombia, but I think that those are the ones that transcend borders about group dynamics in societies. I had someone come up to me and say, I have a 14-year-old at home and I see her and her relationship with her friends, and it's not too different from what I saw on the screen in American high school. And I thought that was funny because clearly there must be some reason why all middle schoolers are generally very taken with Lord of the Flies, because it might not be too far away from what they experience.
So you mentioned Lord of the Flies and Heart of Darkness. I'm wondering if there were films that were important to you. Obviously this is a film that, I don't know if it's in the genre, but it sort of relates to the genre of war movies. And of course, if you mention Heart of Darkness, you think of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did want to play very purposefully with things that were already in popular, let's say, a culture, because this is a war that, it's not fought by one of the great imperial powers. This isn't the Soviet Union, this is the United States or France. So, but those are the countries that generally export their war films, and that's the point of view that we see war from. So I want to speak to that genre, but tell it from our point of view. And so certainly Apocalypse Now is a big reference because it's taking Kurtz from Heart of Darkness and taking it to now questioning America's identity in the context of Vietnam War. I think certainly Peter Brook's original Lord of the Flies is a great film, and also I saw a lot of films that spoke about adolescence because that was a key thing of the film. There's the outer conflict that you see, but the big question is the inner conflict, which is something that's universal. We all experience adolescence, and it's a time of great angst, right? I think your body's changing, your voice is changing, there's a metamorphosis, you desperately want to belong, but you also want to be alone. So I think combining the adolescent inner conflict with that exterior conflict is what kind of brings that film both something specific and universal at the time. And so yeah, everything from maybe Harmony Korine's Gumo to the Russian film also Come and See, which I think is such a remarkable film. So yeah, I think we were purposefully trying to speak to that genre, and you see the pig's head on the stake, which is an homage to Lord of the Flies, things that people relate to, but in a completely different way, in a different context. So the idea was to take something you've seen and turn it on its head. I find like metaphors to be most kind of exciting when it might be something that you might know, but then it's presented in a way that you don't expect. It's more subversive that way.
Okay, I think we can take one more audience question, and right there.
I'm curious what your research process was like, and sort of as you approach research, how you were thinking about, creating a film that is very evocative for a lot of people in terms of the conflict that it evokes, but also looking at research with an eye to not picking a side in the conflict.
I mean, I took from a lot of places, and from the story and the production design, we took from a lot of unconventional conflicts, and different times and eras. We looked at everything from the Cuban Revolution to, for example, Russia in Crimea, but supposedly not there, so they had these new uniforms, so no one knew it was them, but everyone knew. So we looked at that, we looked at Syria, all sorts of unconventional conflicts, and I also looked at, spoke to people that had been kidnapped and also read a lot of their books when they came out. And a lot of things seem very heightened. People ask me, how real is this? Well, since the beginning of time, hostage taking or kidnapping has been part of war. And many times the cheapest way of taking care of this hostage, be it for just a pure economic ransom or gaining some political leverage, is giving them to the lowest rung of the military hierarchy, which are the youngest soldiers, and many times they're kids. So it's very common, it's happened in Colombia, where the bosses are negotiating this kidnapping, but the day-to-day is just with a bunch of kids. And I read those testimonies that I found pretty remarkable for the person that was being kidnapped, as well as the people there that are in the back lines of war. And that was kind of one of the attractive things for me, which was how do I tell a war equally as intensely, but from the back lines and from the lowest rung of the ladder, as opposed to those very glorious, romantic front lines that you generally see in war. And to create, with that violence, something where you see the effects of the violence, not on the person that's suffering the violence, but on the very execution of that violence. Like, for example, for me, it's very strong when I see the effect on Doctora after she's killed the little girls. So you see violence working like a sort of hall of mirrors. That for me is like, when violence is used like that, then I think it's pushing something forward, like the image of the little kids under the table after the parents have been killed, and how you see that those faces reflected on the face of Lady when she's staring at them. So all these type of things, I think, kind of infuse the work.
I think we have to wrap it up. That was great, and thank you both of you, Moises and Alejandro, for the film and for being here.